There is a room you will never see. It exists in a facility with no name, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and concrete, somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia. The room is small, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls painted a specific shade of gray, not quite white, not quite anything, a color chosen because it registers in the human eye without triggering any emotional response whatsoever. In this room there is a chair, a set of headphones and a screen that flickers with a pale, constant light. And in this room, over the course of 72 hours, a man can be unmade and rebuilt into something else entirely. His name doesn't matter now. Let's call him Private Jensen, though that's not his real name, because his real name was one of the first things they took from him. He arrived at this facility in the autumn of 1953, fresh from basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, lean and eager and 20 years old. He had joined the army because his father had served, because his town was small and offered nothing, because the recruiter had looked him in the eye and told him he could be more than what he was. And he believed it, the way young men have always believed in the promise of transformation through service. What Private Jensen didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had been selected not for his strength or his marksmanship or his capacity to endure hardship, but for something else entirely, for his psychological profile, for the particular way his mind responded to authority, for his measured tendency toward compliance without the dangerous edge of zealotry. He was perfect. And perfection in this context meant malleable. The program had no official name in the records that survived, though internally it was referred to as Project Resonance, a term borrowed from physics, from the principle that when a force is applied at the natural frequency of an object, that object will vibrate with increasing amplitude until something fundamental gives way. The architects of this program understood that the human mind operates on frequencies too, that consciousness itself is a kind of oscillation between stimuli and response, and that if you could find the right frequency, the right rhythm, the right sequence of words delivered at precisely the right intervals, you could make a mind resonate until its defenses collapsed and it became receptive to restructuring. This was not torture in the conventional sense. There were no electrodes, no waterboards, no stress positions designed to break the body so the mind would follow. The methods employed at this facility were quieter, cleaner, more elegant in their brutality. They understood that the body recovers, that pain fades, that scars become stories men tell to prove they survived. But language delivered in the right way at the right frequency, with the right degree of repetition, language could rewrite the internal narrative a person tells themselves about who they are and what they must do. And once that narrative was rewritten, once it was carved deep enough into the architecture of thought itself, it became indistinguishable from belief, from identity, from the foundation of will. Private Jensen entered the room on a Tuesday morning at 0600 hours. He had been told he was participating in an auditory acuity test, part of a routine evaluation for communication specialists. He sat in the chair willingly, adjusted the headphones when instructed, fixed his eyes on the screen as requested. The door closed behind him with a sound like an exhale, and then there was only the hum of ventilation and the gray walls and the flicker of light that held no images, only shifting patterns of brightness and shadow designed to prevent his eyes from focusing, from resting, from giving his mind any anchor point in the external world. And then the voice began. It came through the headphones, not loud but persistent, a male voice, calm and measured and utterly without emotion, speaking in a tone that registered just below the threshold of alarm, just above the frequency of dismissal. The words were simple at first, statements of fact delivered with absolute certainty. You are a soldier. You exist to serve. Your purpose is obedience. Your strength is in following orders. Your identity is your duty. Each statement was followed by a pause, exactly 3 seconds long, a silence calculated to allow the words to settle into the listener's consciousness without giving the mind enough time to formulate a counter-argument or critical response. Then the sequence would repeat, the same words in the same order with the same cadence, over and over, a loop that continued without variation for the first 6 hours. Private Jensen listened. At first, he was alert, analytical, noting the strangeness of the exercise, wondering when the actual test would begin. After the first hour, his attention began to drift, his thoughts wandering to memories of home, of the girl he'd left behind, of the last meal he'd eaten before arriving at the facility. But the voice continued, relentless and unchanging, and slowly, gradually, his wandering thoughts began to collide with the words being fed into his ears. You're a soldier. The phrase would intercept a memory mid-formation, would insert itself into the flow of his internal monologue like a stone dropped into water, creating ripples that disrupted the natural current of his thinking. By the third hour he was tired. The light on the screen pulsed in patterns that prevented his eyes from closing fully, kept him in a state of perpetual near-wakefulness, suspended between consciousness and the edge of sleep. His body remained still in the chair, but his mind had begun to lose its boundaries, its sense of where his thoughts ended and the words in his headphones began. You exist to serve. The phrase arrived not as an external command but as something closer to his own voice, his own conclusion, as if he had always known this truth and the voice was simply reminding him of what he'd forgotten. By the 6th hour, when the first sequence finally ended, Private Jensen no longer questioned why he was there. The reason had become self-evident. He was there because soldiers must be tested, must be refined, must be made ready for the demands that service requires. When the voice shifted to a new sequence, he barely registered the change, his mind now conditioned to receive rather than resist, to absorb rather than analyze. The second sequence introduced more complex concepts, layered meanings delivered in the same calm, relentless cadence. Doubt is weakness. Hesitation is betrayal. Questions are the enemy of action. To think is to fail. To obey is to survive. These were not mere suggestions. They were presented as immutable laws of existence, truths as fundamental as gravity, as inescapable as mortality. And because they arrived in the voice that had already established itself as the voice of authority, the voice that Private Jensen's exhausted mind had begun to internalize as something close to his own consciousness, they met almost no resistance. The technique was grounded in research that would not become public for decades, studies conducted in basement laboratories at universities whose names would eventually become synonymous with institutional prestige and ethical failure. The researchers had discovered that the human capacity for independent thought is not a constant but a resource, a form of cognitive energy that depletes with use and requires rest to replenish. When that resource is exhausted through sustained attention, sensory monotony, and the prevention of sleep, the mind enters a state of heightened suggestibility, a condition in which it will accept almost any framework that provides structure, meaning, and relief from the discomfort of uncertainty. Private Jensen was now in that state. His sense of self had become porous, permeable, a vessel waiting to be filled with whatever narrative was offered. The voice had become his companion, his guide, the only stable element in an environment deliberately designed to strip away all other anchors. When it told him that doubt was weakness, he felt the truth of it in his chest, felt the weight of his own questions as something shameful, something to be discarded. When it told him that obedience was survival, he understood this not as a command but as a revelation, a key to existence he had somehow failed to grasp until this moment. By the 12th hour, the pauses between phrases had shortened, the rhythm accelerating, creating a sense of urgency, of momentum, as if the truth being delivered was too important to be delayed by silence. Your life belongs to your nation. Your will is not your own. You are the instrument. You are the weapon. You are the extension of a greater purpose. The words poured into him like liquid filling a mold, taking the shape of his consciousness, hardening into something permanent and inescapable. At the 24-hour mark, Private Jensen had stopped thinking in sentences. His internal monologue had fragmented into echoes of the phrases he had been hearing, a constant loop of abbreviated commands and identity statements that cycled through his awareness without his conscious direction. Serve, obey, exist for duty. He was no longer listening to the voice. He had become the voice, his thoughts now indistinguishable from the programming being fed through the headphones. The technicians monitoring him from the adjacent room took notes on clipboards, recording physiological data, brainwave patterns, eye movement frequencies. They noted the moment when his resistance stopped, when the micro-expressions of confusion and discomfort vanished from his face and were replaced by a kind of blank receptivity, an openness that signaled complete psychological penetration. They had seen this before in previous subjects, this moment of transformation, and they documented it with the clinical detachment of scientists observing a chemical reaction reaching completion. The third sequence began at hour 36, and with it came the insertion of specific behavioral directives, commands embedded within the broader framework of obedience that had already been established. When ordered, you will act without thought. When commanded, you will move without question. Your body is a tool. Your mind is a weapon. You do not choose. You execute. These directives were woven into narratives, small vignettes delivered in the same monotone voice, describing scenarios in which soldiers received orders and carried them out with perfect, mechanical precision, in which hesitation led to failure and obedience led to success, in which the men who questioned were the men who died and the men who obeyed were the men who survived. Private Jensen absorbed these narratives not as fiction but as memories, as lessons learned from experience, as truths verified by reality itself. In his exhausted, suggestible state, he could see these scenarios playing out in his mind with vivid clarity, could feel himself in those situations, could experience the outcomes as if they had already happened to him. The line between what he had been told and what he had lived began to dissolve, and with it dissolved the last remnants of his capacity to distinguish programming from perception. At hour 48 they introduced the trigger phrase. It was embedded within the larger stream of commands, repeated at irregular intervals, never announced as significant, never highlighted as different from the surrounding material. The phrase itself was mundane, 9 words in a specific sequence that meant nothing on their own but had been chosen for their phonetic distinctiveness, for the particular pattern they created when spoken in that order. When Private Jensen heard this phrase when it was delivered to him by someone he recognized as an authority, it would serve as a key, unlocking the entire program of conditioning that had been installed in his mind over the past 2 days, activating the behavioral directives, suppressing the critical faculties that might ordinarily intervene between command and action. He heard the phrase 37 times during the final 24 hours. Each repetition carved it deeper into his neural pathways, linked it more firmly to the state of absolute compliance he had been programmed to enter. By the time the 72-hour mark arrived and the voice finally stopped and the headphones were removed and Private Jensen was allowed to stand on legs that barely supported his weight, the phrase had become part of him, a switch wired directly into the operating system of his consciousness. They fed him then, bland food consumed in silence in a white room with no windows, and they let him sleep for exactly 4 hours, not enough to fully recover but enough to stabilize his cognitive function at a level that would allow him to perform basic tasks without arousing suspicion. When he woke, he remembered almost nothing of what had happened in the gray room, only a vague sense of time passing, of words washing over him, of something fundamental shifting inside his understanding of himself. But he didn't question it. He didn't feel disturbed. He felt, if anything, clearer than he had before, more certain of his purpose, more aligned with his role as a soldier in service to something greater than himself. The testing phase began 3 days later in a controlled environment designed to simulate combat conditions. Private Jensen and 11 other soldiers, all of whom had undergone similar conditioning through Project Resonance, were divided into 2 squads and given a tactical objective, a mock operation that required coordination, decision-making, and initiative under pressure. The exercise proceeded normally for the first 30 minutes, with both squads moving through the terrain, communicating via radio, adapting to unexpected obstacles as they had been trained to do. Then the commanding officer, a man who had been briefed on the true nature of the exercise, spoke the trigger phrase over the radio net, his voice calm and authoritative and directed specifically at Private Jensen's squad. The effect was immediate and absolute. Private Jensen and the 5 other conditioned soldiers in his squad stopped thinking. They didn't stop moving, didn't stop functioning, but the part of their minds that evaluated, that questioned, that weighed options and considered consequences, that part went dark, shut down by the activation of the program that had been installed in the gray room. When the command came, delivered in the same breath as the trigger phrase, they executed it without hesitation, without discussion, without the brief pause that naturally occurs when human beings are asked to do something that conflicts with their training or their judgment or their survival instinct. The command was deliberately designed to test this, to push them beyond the boundaries of what a normally functioning soldier would accept. And they obeyed, all 6 of them, moving in perfect synchronization, carrying out an action that violated every tactical principle they had learned, that placed them in unnecessary danger, that made no strategic sense whatsoever. The other squad, composed of soldiers who had not been conditioned, watched in confusion, then alarm, then something close to horror as their teammates executed a maneuver that was clearly, obviously wrong. Later, when the exercise was over and debriefings were conducted, those unconditioned soldiers reported feeling like they had been watching machines dressed in human skin, moving with purpose but without any visible thought, obeying with a completeness that felt fundamentally inhuman. Private Jensen, when asked to explain his actions, could not. He knew he had followed orders. He knew the orders had been given by a superior officer. Beyond that, he had no clear memory of deciding to act, no recollection of weighing options or considering alternatives. The action and the command had been one thing, instantaneous and inseparable, the way a reflex is inseparable from the stimulus that triggers it. He felt no confusion about this. It seemed right to him, seemed like how things should be, like the natural and proper relationship between soldier and command. The program was deemed a success. The reports filed by the officers overseeing Project Resonance concluded that the conditioning protocol could reliably produce soldiers whose obedience was absolute, whose capacity for independent thought in the presence of the trigger phrase was effectively nullified, and whose performance under those conditions was mechanically precise. They noted that the subjects showed no signs of psychological distress following activation, no guilt or moral conflict or emotional aftermath. The programming was clean, elegant, self-sustaining. Once installed, it required no maintenance, no reinforcement, no ongoing manipulation. It simply existed, dormant until activated, and then it executed exactly as designed. But there were complications. There are always complications when you treat human consciousness as software to be rewritten, when you reduce the complexity of human will to a series of triggers and responses. The first signs appeared approximately 6 weeks after conditioning, when Private Jensen began to experience episodes of dissociation, moments when he would lose track of time, find himself standing in places with no memory of how he had arrived, discover gaps in his recollection of events that should have been routine and memorable. His personality had changed in subtle ways that his friends noticed but couldn't quite articulate. He was quieter, more withdrawn, less likely to laugh or express opinions or engage in the kind of casual banter that helped soldiers endure the monotony of military life. He went to the base medical officer complaining of headaches, of difficulty sleeping, of a persistent sense that something inside him had been rearranged. The medical officer, who was not cleared for information about Project Resonance, diagnosed stress and prescribed rest, suggested Private Jensen was simply adjusting to the demands of military service. But the symptoms persisted and eventually escalated, the dissociative episodes becoming longer and more frequent, until one day Private Jensen was found standing motionless in the middle of a training field, staring at nothing, unresponsive to his name, locked in some internal state that resembled catatonia more than consciousness. They brought him back to the facility then, back to the room with the gray walls, not to recondition him but to assess what had gone wrong, to determine whether the programming had destabilized or whether this was simply an individual case of psychological fragility that their screening process had failed to identify. The evaluation concluded that Private Jensen's conditioning was intact, still fully functional, still capable of being triggered to produce absolute obedience. The dissociation, the gaps in memory, the personality changes, these were side effects, collateral damage from the violence of rewiring a human mind, but they were not considered critical failures because they did not impair his ability to follow orders when the trigger was activated. Private Jensen was returned to regular duty with a notation in his classified file, a code that indicated he was a resonance subject, that his behavior should be monitored, that certain protocols should be followed if his condition deteriorated further. He served another 18 months before the episodes became so severe that he could no longer function in a standard military environment, at which point he was given a medical discharge with an honorable service record and a diagnosis that mentioned nothing about conditioning or programming or psychological experimentation, only the vague language of adjustment disorder and recommended ongoing psychiatric care. He returned to his hometown in Nebraska, married the girl who had waited for him, found work at a grain elevator, and try to build a normal life out of the fragments of the person he had been before entering that gray room. But he was never quite whole, never quite present in the way people expect another person to be present. His wife would later describe him as someone who seemed to be watching himself from a distance, going through the motions of existence without fully inhabiting his own experience. He had nightmares that he couldn't remember upon waking, lost stretches of time that he couldn't account for, moments when he would suddenly become rigid and still, as if listening to something no one else could hear. He died in 1971 at the age of 38, alone in his garage, the engine of his truck running, the door closed, no note, no explanation. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, and the few people who knew him expressed the kind of sad inevitability that comes when someone who has been visibly broken for years finally makes the break permanent. What no one knew, what couldn't have been known by anyone outside of the sealed files of Project Resonance, was that Private Jensen had never truly been alone in his own mind since those 72 hours in 1953, that some part of him had remained in that room, still listening to that voice, still trying to obey commands that never stopped echoing through the architecture of his consciousness. Project Resonance continued for another 7 years after Private Jensen's conditioning, expanding in scope and sophistication, testing new frequencies, new phrase structures, new methods of delivery that reduced the time required for full conditioning from 72 hours to 48 to eventually 36. The researchers refined the trigger mechanism, experimented with multiple triggers that could produce different behavioral responses, explored the possibility of creating layered programming that could be activated and deactivated in sequence like subroutines in a computer program. They documented everything with meticulous care: physiological responses, psychological profiles, success rates, failure modes, side effects, long-term outcomes. But the program was never expanded beyond the experimental phase, never implemented on a large scale, never integrated into standard military training protocols. The reasons for this were not ethical, though there were certainly internal debates about the morality of treating soldiers as programmable machines, debates that left traces in the marginalia of memos and the cautious language of certain reports. The primary reasons were practical. The conditioning was effective in producing obedience, but it was unstable, unpredictable in its long-term effects and the side effects: the dissociation, the personality disintegration, the increased rates of suicide and psychological breakdown among subjects, were too visible, too difficult to conceal, too likely to raise questions that the military was not prepared to answer. So Project Resonance was quietly discontinued in 1960, its files sealed, its funding reallocated to other programs with cleaner outcomes and less troubling implications. The surviving subjects were scattered across the country, their conditioning still intact but no longer actively monitored, living their lives with this dormant program buried in their minds, a weapon that no one intended to activate again. Most of them never knew what had been done to them, never connected their psychological difficulties to those hours in rooms painted specific shades of gray, never understood that the voice they sometimes heard in moments of stress or exhaustion was not a symptom of madness but an echo of deliberate modification. A few tried to speak about their experiences, tried to describe what had happened to them during the evaluations that had seemed routine at the time, but their accounts were fragmentary, confused, easily dismissed as the confabulations of men whose service had damaged them in ways that defied clear diagnosis. The military denied everything, not aggressively but with the gentle firmness of an institution that has learned how to make inconvenient truths disappear into the vast bureaucratic machinery of classification and compartmentalization. And so the story of Project Resonance became one more entry in the long catalog of experiments that were conducted in the name of national security, that pushed the boundaries of what could be done to human beings in service of military advantage, that succeeded technically while failing morally, and that were ultimately abandoned not because they were wrong but because they were inconvenient. But the techniques developed during Project Resonance did not disappear. They evolved, migrated, reappeared in different contexts with different names, stripped of their most obvious cruelties but retaining their essential insight about how human consciousness can be shaped through rhythm, repetition, and the careful control of information. The understanding that people become what they hear, what they are told, what they absorb during moments of vulnerability, this understanding became foundational to fields that seem far removed from gray rooms and conditioning protocols, fields like marketing and education and political messaging and entertainment. Consider the soldier who sits in a chair for 72 hours, headphones delivering a voice that tells him what he is and what he must do, words repeated until they become indistinguishable from his own thoughts, until obedience feels like choice and compliance feels like identity. Now consider the citizen who spends hours each day consuming media, voices from screens telling them what to fear and what to desire, what to believe and what to reject, messages repeated with enough frequency and consistency that they begin to feel like personal conclusions rather than external programming. The scale is different, the intensity less concentrated, the violence more subtle, but the principle remains unchanged. Consciousness is not fixed. Identity is not immutable. The self is a story that can be edited, revised, overwritten, if you know the right frequency and have access to the delivery mechanism and possess the patience to let repetition do its work. The voice doesn't have to come through headphones in a locked room. It can come through a television screen, a smartphone, a social media feed, a news broadcast, a political speech, an advertisement, any channel that gains access to attention and holds it long enough for messages to settle into the substrate of thought. The trigger doesn't have to be a specific phrase spoken by a commanding officer. It can be an image, a symbol, a word that carries emotional weight, a narrative framework that activates patterns of response that have been carefully cultivated over time. The goal doesn't have to be military obedience. It can be consumer behavior, political alignment, social conformity, the maintenance of systems that benefit from people who have been conditioned to see their role within those systems as natural, necessary, and beyond questioning. Project Resonance succeeded in proving that a human being could be reduced to a mechanism, a tool, a thing that responded to input with predictable output, that the complexity of consciousness and the dignity of choice could be circumvented entirely through the right application of psychological pressure delivered in the right conditions. And having proved this, having demonstrated that the technology existed to turn people into programmable instruments, it became not a question of whether such techniques would be used but only a question of scale, subtlety, and plausible deniability. The rooms are different now. The walls are not gray but glowing, not confining but omnipresent, not locked from the outside but entered voluntarily, compulsively, dozens of times each day. The voice is not monotone but varied, not obviously authoritarian but friendly, relatable, designed to feel like a conversation rather than a command. The messages are not delivered in unbroken streams over 72 hours but dispersed across days and weeks and years, accumulated gradually until they form a worldview that feels self-constructed but was actually assembled from fragments of programming delivered through 1,000 different channels, each one reinforcing the others, each one pushing consciousness toward conclusions that serve purposes the subject may never fully understand. And the triggers are everywhere. Words that produce anger on command, images that generate fear with Pavlovian reliability, narratives that activate tribal loyalties and shut down critical thinking as effectively as any phrase whispered into the headphones of a soldier in a gray room. We are all, to varying degrees, subjects in an ongoing experiment, our responses measured, our behaviors modified, our consciousness shaped by systems that have learned the lessons of places like Project Resonance and applied them at a scale that would have seemed impossible in 1953 but is simply the invisible architecture of modern existence now. The soldier in the chair was not an aberration. He was a prototype. The conditioning he underwent was not a unique atrocity but a proof of concept, a demonstration of principles that have since been refined, democratized, woven into the fabric of how information moves and attention is captured and consensus is manufactured. His experience was extreme in its concentration, its purity, its obvious violence, but the mechanism was not fundamentally different from the processes that shape belief and behavior in environments that seem free, seem open, seem to offer choice. You might wonder where the line is, where normal persuasion ends and programming begins, where the influence of culture and education and social pressure becomes something darker, something that deserves the language of control and conditioning rather than the softer language of influence and socialization. The answer is that there is no clean line, no moment when we cross from one territory into another. There is only a spectrum, a gradient that runs from gentle suggestion through repetition and reinforcement to the kind of total psychological domination demonstrated in that gray room in West Virginia. And we are all somewhere on that spectrum, our position determined by factors we may not fully perceive, how much we are exposed to certain messages, how vulnerable we are when those messages arrive, how effectively the messages are designed to bypass our critical defenses and plant themselves directly into the substrate of belief. The most sophisticated form of control is the kind that doesn't feel like control, that masquerades as freedom, that allows the subject to believe they are making choices when in fact they are executing programs, following scripts, responding to triggers that were installed so gradually and so skillfully that they feel like organic parts of consciousness rather than external impositions. This is what Project Resonance was ultimately working toward, not the crude domination of a man locked in a room and bombarded with commands, but the elegant invisibility of programming that operates so seamlessly that the programmed never suspect they are anything other than autonomous, independent, free. Private Jensen died believing he had lived his own life, made his own decisions, suffered from problems that were personal and internal rather than the result of what had been done to him in a place he barely remembered. He never understood that the voice in his head, the one that sometimes told him he was worthless and hollow and better off not existing, was not his voice but an echo of the programming that had been installed when he was 20 years old and desperate to serve his country. He never knew that his suicide was, in a very real sense, an act of obedience, the final execution of a command that had been embedded in his mind decades earlier and had been cycling through his consciousness ever since, wearing away at his sense of self until there was nothing left but the mechanism and the voice and the understanding that compliance was the only available response. This is what happens when you treat human beings as systems to be engineered rather than souls to be respected, when you reduce consciousness to a problem of input and output, when you forget or choose to ignore the fact that there is something in the human person that resists being turned into a tool, something that breaks under that kind of pressure even as it bends to comply. Project Resonance produced obedient soldiers. It also produced ghosts, men who were alive but not quite present, who functioned but did not flourish, who carried invisible wounds that no one knew how to heal because no one was willing to acknowledge how those wounds had been inflicted. And the experiment continues, not in locked rooms but in the open, not with soldiers but with citizens, not with the crude methods of 1953 but with techniques that have evolved to match the technologies and the sensibilities of the present moment. The goal remains the same, to shape consciousness, to direct behavior, to create populations that respond reliably to the right stimuli, that act without thinking too deeply, that obey without recognizing obedience as something distinct from choice. The scale is larger. The methods are subtler. The results are harder to measure but no less real. You are reading these words now and you may feel that you are doing so freely, that your attention is your own to direct, that your thoughts about what you are reading are authentically yours. And perhaps they are. Or perhaps you are also a subject, also conditioned in ways you cannot fully perceive, also responding to programming that was installed gradually over years of exposure to messages designed to shape how you think about authority, obedience, freedom, and control. Perhaps the voice in your head that evaluates these claims, that judges their plausibility or dismisses their implications, is not entirely your voice but an amalgamation of all the voices you have absorbed, all the narratives you have internalized, all the programming that has been delivered through every channel that has ever held your attention long enough to plant something in the fertile darkness of your subconscious. There is no test you can perform to determine the answer with certainty. There is no way to audit your own consciousness, to separate what is genuinely yours from what was installed, to distinguish between belief and conditioning. You can only notice, pay attention, cultivate awareness of the moments when your thoughts seem to arrive fully formed without any clear origin, when your reactions seem disproportionate or automated, when your certainties feel like conclusions you reached but cannot remember reaching. You can only ask yourself, in the spirit of honest inquiry rather than paranoid suspicion, how much of what you believe is the result of deliberate exposure to messages designed to produce exactly those beliefs. The story of Private Jensen is not ancient history. It is not a cautionary tale about mistakes we learned from and moved past. It is a blueprint, a demonstration of principles that are still in use, still being refined, still shaping consciousness on scales that would have been unimaginable to the architects of Project Resonance but which followed directly from the insights they generated in those gray rooms in the mountains of West Virginia. The technology has changed. The essential understanding has not. People become what they hear. Identity is constructed from repetition. Consciousness is permeable. And control, real control, the kind that endures and scales and reproduces itself across generations, control is not achieved through force or explicit command but through the patient, persistent, invisible work of programming delivered at the right frequency until it feels like freedom. The soldier in the chair was never freed. He was only released, sent back into a world where the conditioning continued in different forms, where the voice never truly stopped, where obedience remained the fundamental organizing principle of his existence even though the commands came from sources he no longer recognized as external authorities. He lived, functioned, performed the rituals of normalcy, but some essential part of him remained locked in that room, still listening, still trying to comply with instructions that had become inseparable from his sense of what he was and what he must do to justify his continued existence. We are all, in our own ways, still in that room. The walls are just harder to see. The voice is just harder to distinguish from our own thoughts. The programming is just sophisticated enough to feel like agency, like choice, like the authentic expression of free will. But the mechanism is the same. The principles have not changed. Words repeated long enough become obedience. Identity constructed from repeated messages becomes indistinguishable from nature. And between sound and silence, in the spaces where attention is held and messages are delivered and consciousness is shaped by forces it cannot fully perceive, programming continues to operate, continues to turn human beings into instruments, continues to demonstrate that the line between person and machine, between will and mechanism, is thinner and more permeable than we would like to believe. This is the archive that was never meant to be opened, the truth that serves no one's interest to acknowledge, the understanding that, once fully grasped, makes it impossible to experience your own thoughts with quite the same confidence in their autonomous origin. You have been programmed. We have all been programmed. The question is not whether but to what degree, not if but how effectively, not whether control exists but whether you are capable of recognizing it when it operates through mechanisms so subtle and pervasive that they feel like nothing more than the ordinary texture of existence in a world saturated with messages, voices, commands disguised as entertainment or information or casual conversation. Private Jensen could have been anyone. He was selected not because he was weak but because he was normal, because his mind worked the way minds are supposed to work, processing information, seeking patterns, constructing meaning from repetition. That is precisely what made him vulnerable. His capacity to learn, to adapt, to absorb messages and integrate them into his understanding of reality, these were not flaws but features, the very mechanisms that make human consciousness functional, turned against themselves, weaponized, exploited by people who understood that the brain does not distinguish between truth and repetition, between authentic belief and installed programming, between choice and conditioned response. You cannot opt out. There is no room you can seal yourself in that will protect you from exposure to the voices, the messages, the persistent shaping forces of a civilization that has learned how consciousness works and uses that knowledge without apology and without restraint. You can only develop awareness, cultivate critical distance, notice the moments when your thoughts arrive with the suspicious smoothness of pre-recorded messages, when your reactions feel like reflexes rather than responses, when your certainties bear the unmistakable marks of programming delivered so skillfully that it feels like discovery. The archive is still open. The experiments continue. The voice has never stopped speaking. And somewhere, in a room you will never see, in a facility with no name, another mind is being rewritten, another person is being reduced to mechanism, another demonstration is being conducted of the fundamental principle that consciousness is not sacred, identity is not protected, and the human capacity for obedience is limited only by the sophistication of the techniques used to cultivate it. You are a soldier in a war you may not recognize as a war. The battlefield is your attention. The weapon is information. The objective is your compliance. And the only defense is the difficult, uncomfortable, perpetually incomplete work of asking whether what you think is what you think, or whether you are simply executing a program installed so carefully that you mistake its operation for the authentic movement of your own mind. The files from Project Resonance that survived the purges and the redactions tell a story that is both more mundane and more terrifying than the dramatic narratives of brainwashing and mind control that populate popular imagination. There were no mad scientists cackling over breakthrough discoveries, no dramatic moments of revelation when a subject suddenly broke and became a puppet. There was only the patient application of known principles, the systematic exploitation of how memory consolidates and attention fatigues and meaning emerges from repetition. The horror was not in the novelty of what they discovered but in the efficiency of what they confirmed, that a human being is, at its neurological foundation, a pattern recognition system that will eventually accept any pattern repeated with sufficient frequency and consistency as true, necessary, fundamental. The researchers who designed Project Resonance were not monsters in the conventional sense. They were educated men, many with advanced degrees in psychology and neuroscience, who understood themselves to be serving their nation during a period of existential threat, when the Cold War had made the manipulation of consciousness seem not like a moral catastrophe but like a strategic necessity. They wrote papers with careful methodology sections and peer-reviewed conclusions. They followed protocols. They documented their failures as rigorously as their successes. They believed, or at least told themselves they believed, that the knowledge they were generating would ultimately serve the cause of freedom, that by understanding how minds could be controlled they were actually protecting American consciousness from the techniques being developed by adversaries who would not hesitate to use them. This is how atrocity always justifies itself, by positioning cruelty as defense, by framing violation as necessity, by claiming that the people being damaged are being damaged for their own protection or for some greater good that transcends their individual suffering. The men who designed the conditioning protocols for Project Resonance saw themselves as patriots, as defenders, as scientists pushing the boundaries of human knowledge in service of noble ends. They did not see themselves as architects of a system that would destroy minds, fracture identities, and produce a generation of veterans whose psychological deterioration would be blamed on individual weakness rather than institutional violence. But intention does not mitigate outcome. The suffering of the subjects was real regardless of how their programmers rationalized the process. Private Jensen's disintegration was not made less tragic by the fact that the people who conditioned him believed they were serving America. The suicide rate among Project Resonance subjects, which was documented internally but never released publicly, was not rendered acceptable by the strategic value of the research. And the fact that the techniques developed in those gray rooms eventually migrated into commercial and political applications does not transform those applications into benign influence just because the context has changed from military to civilian, from explicit to implicit, from coercive to nominally voluntary. There is a particularly disturbing document that survived in the Project Resonance files, a memo dated June 1958, written by one of the senior researchers to the program director. In it, he discusses what he calls the scalability problem. The conditioning protocols were effective, he notes, but they required specialized facilities, trained personnel, and extended periods of isolated contact with subjects. This made them impractical for large-scale implementation. What the military needed, he suggested, was a way to achieve similar results through methods that could be deployed widely, that did not require physical confinement, that could operate in plain sight without triggering ethical objections or legal obstacles. The memo goes on to propose research into what he terms ambient conditioning, the use of mass media, institutional messaging, and cultural narratives to shape consciousness at a population level using the same principles that had proven effective in individual cases. He notes that the radio and television infrastructure already exists to deliver repeated messages to millions of people simultaneously, that schools and churches and civic organizations provide natural channels for authoritative voices to shape belief systems during developmentally vulnerable periods, that the fragmentation of attention in modern life creates precisely the kind of cognitive fatigue that makes people susceptible to simple, repeated messages delivered with confidence. The memo concludes with a recommendation that the program pivot from direct conditioning of individual soldiers to research on mass influence techniques, from the production of perfectly obedient individuals to the cultivation of generally compliant populations. He suggests that this shift would not only make the research more scalable but would also make it more defensible, since people who are influenced through exposure to media and cultural messaging can always be said to have chosen their beliefs freely, to have arrived at their conclusions through their own reasoning rather than through external programming. There is no evidence that this specific recommendation was officially adopted, no paper trail connecting Project Resonance directly to subsequent government programs in psychological operations or public diplomacy or strategic communication. But the fact that the recommendation was made, that it was considered plausible, that it reflected an understanding that the techniques proven effective in a locked room could be adapted for use in an open society, this fact alone reveals something crucial about how power thinks, about the ambitions that animate institutions when they discover methods of shaping consciousness, about the inevitable trajectory from experimental cruelty to normalized control. The television arrived in American homes in the 1950s, during the same years that Project Resonance was refining its conditioning protocols. By 1960, 90% of American households had at least one television set, and the average American was spending hours each day sitting in front of a screen, absorbing messages, watching narratives, learning what to fear and what to desire from voices that spoke with authority and consistency in the hypnotic rhythm of professional production. The researchers at Project Resonance would have recognized the mechanism immediately. A captive audience, sustained attention, repeated exposure to carefully crafted messages delivered by authoritative sources in an environment designed to minimize critical resistance. The content was different, certainly. Entertainment rather than explicit commands, advertisements rather than identity statements, news narratives rather than behavioral directives. But the underlying process was structurally similar, consciousness being shaped through repetition, beliefs being formed through sustained exposure, identity being constructed from the accumulated messages absorbed during vulnerable states of attention. The soldier in the gray room and the citizen in the living room were both being programmed, just at different intensities, with different objectives, through different but related technologies. And the effects, while less dramatic in individual cases, were no less real at the population level. Entire generations developed beliefs about what was normal, possible, desirable, dangerous, based not on their direct experience of reality but on the mediated version of reality they absorbed through screens. Political opinions that felt like personal convictions were often just the internalization of narratives repeated so frequently across so many channels that they took on the weight of self-evident truth. Consumer desires that seemed to emerge from authentic preferences were frequently the result of sophisticated messaging designed to create associations between products and identity, between purchases and self-actualization, between consumption and happiness. The line between persuasion and programming is not a question of whether the subject feels coerced but whether they retain the capacity to genuinely consider alternatives, to evaluate claims critically, to resist the momentum of repeated messages and think independently about what they actually believe as opposed to what they have been conditioned to believe. By that standard, much of what passes as normal influence in modern society exists in an ethical gray zone, employing techniques that differ from explicit conditioning primarily in their subtlety, their diffusion across multiple sources, and their plausible deniability. Private Jensen could not have resisted the conditioning he underwent. The protocols were designed to be irresistible, to exploit vulnerabilities inherent in how human consciousness processes information under conditions of fatigue, isolation, and sustained attention. But the citizen watching television, scrolling through social media, absorbing the constant stream of messaging that characterizes contemporary existence, that person has at least the theoretical capacity to resist, to think critically, to question, to refuse the narratives being offered. The fact that most people do not exercise this capacity, that they accept programming as smoothly as Private Jensen accepted his conditioning, suggests that the difference between explicit and ambient control may be less significant than we would like to believe. The soldier who completed the Project Resonance conditioning and then returned to civilian life carried two burdens. The first was the programming itself, the trigger phrases and behavioral directives and identity statements that had been carved into his consciousness during those 72 hours. The second was the knowledge that something had been done to him, some violation had occurred, even if he could not clearly remember or articulate what it was. This second burden was in some ways heavier than the first, because it meant living with the constant suspicion that his thoughts were not entirely his own, that his sense of self had been tampered with, that he was simultaneously the subject experiencing his life and an object being operated by forces he could neither see nor escape. This is the existential condition of anyone who becomes conscious of the possibility of their own programming, who realizes that the messages they have absorbed, the beliefs they have internalized, the identity they have constructed might not be authentic expressions of their deepest nature but rather the accumulated effects of systematic exposure to narratives designed to produce specific outcomes. You cannot return to innocence once this awareness arrives. You cannot unknow the possibility that your thoughts are echoes, your beliefs are installations, your certainties are programs running in the substrate of consciousness without your informed consent. And yet awareness alone does not constitute freedom. Private Jensen knew something had been done to him, and that knowledge did not protect him from the effects of his conditioning, did not prevent the trigger from working, did not stop the slow disintegration of his personality over the years following his discharge. Knowing you have been programmed does not automatically give you the tools to debug yourself, to identify which thoughts are authentic and which are installed, to distinguish between genuine belief and conditioned response. It only adds another layer of doubt, another source of anxiety, another reason to question whether anything you think or feel or want is actually yours. This is why the most sophisticated forms of control do not rely on secrecy but on complexity, on creating such a dense network of influences and messages and narratives that even if you become aware that you are being programmed, you cannot possibly audit all the sources, cannot trace every belief back to its origin, cannot separate yourself from the environment that shaped you. You are always already embedded in systems of influence that operate at scales too large and too diffuse to fully map, let alone escape. Awareness becomes just another burden rather than a path to liberation. The researchers at Project Resonance understood this intuitively, even if they did not articulate it in quite these terms. They knew that once the conditioning was installed, once the programming had been integrated into the subject's consciousness at a deep enough level, it would continue to operate regardless of whether the subject suspected its presence. The trigger would still work. The obedience would still manifest. The only difference would be that the subject might suffer more, might experience their own compliance with greater anguish, might live in a state of perpetual internal conflict between the part of them that wanted to resist and the part that had been designed to obey. In this sense, awareness without power is its own form of torture, a condition in which you are forced to watch yourself execute programs you did not choose, to observe your own thoughts forming along predictable lines, to feel your resistance crumbling in the face of stimuli specifically designed to overwhelm your defenses. You become a spectator to your own mental processes, conscious enough to recognize the patterns but not empowered enough to change them, aware enough to suffer from the knowledge of your own manipulation but not free enough to escape it. This was Private Jensen's condition in the years between his discharge and his death. He knew something was wrong, knew he had been changed in ways that were not natural or healthy, knew that parts of his mind no longer belonged entirely to him. But knowing this did not help him. It only made the experience of being himself more painful, more alienating, more exhausting. He could not explain to his wife what was wrong because he did not have the language for it, did not have access to the files that would have confirmed his suspicions and given him a framework for understanding his experience. He could only feel the wrongness, the sense of being operated rather than operating, the knowledge that his consciousness had been turned into something like a machine. And when he finally died in that garage, when he made the decision or followed the program or executed the final command, it is impossible to say which, impossible to determine where his will ended and his conditioning began. He was not escaping from suffering so much as completing a process that had been set in motion decades earlier, when he sat in a chair and put on headphones and allowed voices to pour into his mind until there was no clear boundary between what he thought and what he had been told to think. This is the true horror of psychological programming at this level of sophistication. It is not that it takes away your freedom in an obvious, dramatic way. It is that it makes freedom itself ambiguous, questionable, possibly illusory. When your thoughts are shaped by forces you did not choose and cannot clearly identify, when your beliefs are constructed from messages delivered by sources that may or may not have your best interests at heart, when your identity is assembled from fragments of programming absorbed over years of exposure to systems designed to influence consciousness. What does it mean to say you are free? What is freedom in a context where every thought might be an echo, every belief might be an installation, every choice might be the execution of a program written by someone else? The files from Project Resonance do not answer this question. They only document that it can be done, that consciousness can be shaped, that obedience can be installed, that people can be reduced to mechanisms if you have the right tools and sufficient access and the willingness to treat human beings as raw material to be processed rather than persons to be respected. The moral question, the question of whether this should be done, was always secondary to the technical question of whether it could be done. And once it was demonstrated that it could be done, the momentum shifted from whether to how, from should we to how far, from is this right to is this useful. America emerged from World War II as the preeminent global power, a nation that had demonstrated its technological superiority, its industrial capacity, its ability to project force anywhere in the world. But the Cold War introduced a different kind of challenge, one that could not be solved purely through military strength or economic dominance. It was a war of ideologies, a competition to demonstrate which system could better organize human society, which vision of the future could command loyalty and sacrifice and belief. And in that context, the ability to shape consciousness, to cultivate compliance, to ensure that your population remained committed to your system even when subjected to competing narratives from adversaries, this ability became as strategically important as weapons systems or intelligence networks. Project Resonance was a small part of a much larger effort to understand and exploit the mechanisms of human psychology for strategic advantage. It existed alongside programs exploring sensory deprivation, chemical persuasion, hypnotic suggestion, behavioral modification through reward and punishment, and dozens of other methods of influencing consciousness without the subject's informed consent. Some of these programs produced useful results that were incorporated into interrogation techniques, training protocols, and psychological operations. Others failed or produced results too unstable or too obviously unethical to be implemented. But all of them reflected a fundamental premise, that the mind is not sacred, that consciousness is just another domain to be mapped and controlled, that the manipulation of belief and identity is a legitimate tool of statecraft when the alternative is allowing your adversaries to manipulate belief and identity instead. This premise did not originate with the Cold War, and it did not end when the Cold War ended. It is ancient and ongoing, woven into the structure of power itself, because power has always understood that the most effective control is not physical but psychological, that people who believe in their own obedience are far more manageable than people who must be constantly coerced, that a population that has internalized the narratives of the ruling order is a population that will police itself, discipline itself, reproduce the conditions of its own subordination without requiring constant oversight or threat of punishment. What changed in the 20th century was not the existence of psychological control but its systematization, its industrialization, its transformation from an art practiced by priests and politicians and propagandists into a science studied in laboratories and refined through experimentation and deployed through technologies that could reach millions of people simultaneously. The soldier in the gray room was not the beginning of this story but a particularly concentrated expression of possibilities that had always existed and were now being explored with unprecedented rigor and ambition. And what has changed in the 21st century is the scale and sophistication of the delivery systems, the amount of data available about individual psychology and vulnerability, the ability to personalize programming in real time based on how a person responds to different messages, different narratives, different emotional appeals. The gray room has been replaced by the algorithm, the headphones by the smartphone, the monotone voice by the endless stream of content calibrated to capture attention and shape belief and guide behavior in directions that serve purposes the user may never fully understand. Private Jensen died in 1971, but the project that conditioned him never really ended. It just became more efficient, more distributed, more invisible. The principles remain the same. The technology has evolved. And the question of what it means to be human, to possess agency, to think your own thoughts and choose your own path, these questions have become more urgent and more difficult to answer with any confidence, because the evidence suggests that very little of what we call consciousness operates independently of the systems that shape it, the messages that construct it, the programming that determines which thoughts feel true and which thoughts feel foreign. You are still reading these words, and by now you may be experiencing some version of the doubt that Private Jensen carried with him for 18 years, the uncomfortable awareness that your mind is not a fortress but a permeable membrane, that thoughts arrive from somewhere and it is not always clear where, that the voice in your head might be less singular and autonomous than you have been led to believe. This doubt is not pleasant. It does not empower you. It only reveals the extent to which your sense of self has been constructed from materials you did not manufacture, shaped by forces you did not control, programmed through processes you did not consent to. But there is a difference between awareness and paralysis. Understanding that you have been influenced, shaped, partially programmed by the culture you inhabit and the messages you have absorbed does not mean you are helpless, does not mean every thought is false, does not mean agency is impossible. It only means that autonomy is not a given but an achievement, something that must be cultivated through constant effort, through the deliberate practice of critical thinking, through the uncomfortable work of questioning your own certainties and examining the origins of your beliefs and asking whether what you think is actually what you think or whether you are executing someone else's program. This work is difficult because it is never complete, because you can never achieve perfect independence from influence, because you are always embedded in contexts that shape how you perceive and interpret and respond to reality. But difficulty is not impossibility. The fact that you cannot achieve perfect freedom does not mean all degrees of freedom are equivalent, does not mean there is no difference between the person who never questions their programming and the person who maintains a constant, critical awareness of how their consciousness is being shaped. Private Jensen did not have access to this possibility. He was conditioned in isolation with techniques designed to be irresistible, during a period when the existence of such programs was not publicly acknowledged and the psychological damage they caused was not recognized or treated. He had no framework for understanding what had been done to him, no community of others who had been similarly damaged, no language for articulating his experience, no resources for resisting or recovering from his conditioning. He was alone with his programming, alone with his triggers, alone with the voice that never stopped speaking even after the headphones were removed. You are not alone in that way. The mechanisms of influence that operate in contemporary society are more visible, more discussed, more subject to scrutiny and criticism than the classified programs of the 1950s. Information about how media shapes belief, how algorithms curate reality, how messaging is designed to bypass critical thinking. This information is available, accessible, documented in books and articles and academic studies. The tools for developing critical awareness, for auditing your own consciousness, for distinguishing between authentic belief and installed programming, these tools exist and can be learned and practiced. But existence and use are different things. The tools are available, but they require effort, attention, the willingness to question comfortable certainties and confront uncomfortable possibilities. Most people do not use them, not because they are incapable but because the work is hard and the results are often destabilizing. In the alternative, simply accepting the narratives you have been given, trusting the voices that sound authoritative, believing that your thoughts are your own, is so much easier, so much less exhausting, so much more compatible with the ordinary demands of survival and social functioning. This is how programming at the population level works. It does not require force. It only requires that the path of least resistance leads toward compliance, that questioning is more difficult than accepting, that the cognitive and emotional cost of maintaining critical independence is high enough that most people, most of the time, will choose comfort over autonomy, certainty over doubt, the security of shared belief over the isolation of skeptical inquiry. And so the experiment continues generations after Project Resonance was officially discontinued, in forms that are harder to see and therefore harder to resist. The voice is always speaking, always delivering messages, always shaping consciousness in directions that serve purposes you may never fully understand. The triggers are embedded everywhere, activated constantly, producing responses that feel like choices but follow patterns that were installed long ago through processes that operated below the threshold of your conscious awareness. Private Jensen sat in a chair for 72 hours and was transformed from a person into a mechanism. How many hours have you spent in front of screens, absorbing messages, internalizing narratives, allowing voices to shape your understanding of what is true and what matters and who you are supposed to be? The room was different. The walls were not gray. The process felt voluntary. But the mechanism was the same, and the outcome, while less dramatic in individual cases, accumulates across populations into something that resembles the conditioning of Project Resonance in its essential nature if not its intensity. The voice in your head is speaking now. It has been speaking throughout this entire narration, evaluating, judging, accepting or rejecting the claims being made, forming opinions about whether what you are hearing is true or exaggerated or paranoid or profound. That voice feels like yours. It sounds like you. But ask yourself, where did it learn to evaluate truth claims? Who taught it what counts as credible and what counts as conspiratorial? Which messages, delivered through which channels, over how many years, shape the criteria it uses to distinguish between reliable information and dangerous misinformation? The answer is that you do not fully know, cannot fully know, because the programming was gradual and diffuse and delivered through so many sources that tracking it all back to origin would require resources and attention you do not have. You can only notice the patterns, pay attention to the moments when your thoughts seem to arrive already formed, maintain enough doubt to create space between the programming and the awareness of being programmed. This is not freedom in the absolute sense. It is only the small degree of freedom that remains available after acknowledging that perfect independence from influence is impossible, that we are all shaped by the cultures we inhabit and the messages we absorb, that consciousness is never truly sovereign but only more or less aware of its own constructed nature. Private Jensen did not have even this small freedom. The conditioning he underwent was designed to eliminate the gap between command and compliance, to reduce consciousness to pure mechanism, to make obedience so total that it felt like identity itself. You still have that gap. It is narrow, fragile, constantly under assault from systems that have learned to exploit attention and shape belief and guide behavior with increasing precision. But it exists, and its existence means that something resembling choice, something resembling agency, something resembling resistance is still possible, still achievable through effort and awareness and the refusal to accept your own programming as inevitable or natural or beyond examination. The question is whether you will use that gap, will inhabit that space between stimulus and response, will practice the difficult discipline of questioning your own mind. Or whether you will let it close, will accept the comfort of certainty, will allow the voice to continue speaking until it is the only voice you can hear, until your thoughts and the programming become so thoroughly merged that distinguishing between them becomes impossible. Private Jensen made his choice in a garage in Nebraska in 1971, though whether it was truly his choice or the final execution of a program that had been running since 1953 is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. You are making your choice now, in this moment, as you read these words and decide what to do with them, how to think about them, whether to let them change how you experience your own consciousness or whether to dismiss them as paranoid speculation and return to the comfortable assumption that your thoughts are entirely your own. Either way, the voice continues. The programming continues. The experiment continues. The war for consciousness never ended. It only became invisible, normalized, integrated into the ordinary functioning of society until it no longer looks like warfare but simply like reality itself. And in that invisibility lies its greatest power, because you cannot resist what you cannot see, cannot oppose what you mistake for nature, cannot escape what you believe to be the fundamental structure of existence itself rather than a contingent arrangement imposed through force and repetition and the patient application of techniques refined over decades of research into how minds break and how consciousness can be rewritten. This is the archive. This is the truth that was never meant to be spoken. This is the voice whispering in the dark that consciousness is not sacred, that identity is not protected, that the distance between person and machine is smaller than we pretend, that we are all subjects in an experiment we did not agree to participate in but cannot escape, that the question is not whether we have been programmed but only how much, how deeply, how irrevocably. Private Jensen never escaped. The conditioning followed him from the facility to his base to his home to his grave, a presence in his mind that never left, never faded, never gave him peace. You carry your own conditioning, your own programming, your own set of installed beliefs and triggered responses and certainties that feel authentic but may be nothing more than echoes of messages repeated so often that they feel like truth. The difference is that you can know this, can maintain awareness of your own constructedness, can practice the discipline of doubt that creates just enough space for something like freedom to exist in the narrow margins between what you have been told and what you actually think. It is not much. It is not enough. But it is what remains when everything else has been programmed, when every channel has been compromised, when every narrative has been designed to produce specific outcomes. It is the small act of resistance available to consciousness that has become aware of its own manipulation without being empowered to fully escape it. It is the gap, the space, the moment between the trigger and the response where choice might still exist, where agency might still operate, where the mechanism might still remember that it was once a person and that personhood, however besieged, however constrained, however programmed, still means something worth protecting. This is where the archive ends. Not with answers but with questions. Not with certainty but with doubt. Not with liberation but with awareness of captivity. The voice will continue speaking after these words end. The programming will continue operating. The war for your consciousness will continue being fought. And you will continue being the battlefield, the prize, the territory contested by forces that understand how you think better than you understand yourself, that shape what you believe before you believe it, that program your responses so thoroughly that compliance feels like conviction and obedience feels like identity. If you have listened this far, you already know too much. The question is what you will do with the knowing, whether it will change how you inhabit your own mind, whether you will develop the discipline of critical awareness that might possibly create enough space for something resembling freedom to operate in the narrow margins between programming and consciousness. The question is whether you can live with the doubt, with the uncertainty, with the uncomfortable knowledge that your thoughts might not be entirely your own. Subscribe to War Archives Black. Remember what you have heard here. And understand that silence is not peace. Silence is control. The voice that stops speaking is not the voice that has been defeated. It is the voice that has been internalized, that has become so thoroughly merged with your own thoughts that you no longer recognize it as separate, as external, as something that was installed rather than something that has always been there. The experiment continues. The archive remains open. And somewhere, in a room you will never see, another mind is being rewritten. Perhaps it is your own.